Tonight, live on In Focus, Newzroom Afrika, Channel 405, energy regulator Nersa has approved an electricity tariff hike for Eskom, but it wasn't the 20.5% that the power utility wanted for the 2022-2023 financial year. The regulator granted Eskom a 9.61% after a long battle in court. Here to talk to us now about this, I'm joined by the Sinan Energy CEO, Mohamed Madhi. Mohamed, good evening and thank you very much for your time. Eskom tariff increase then for 2022-2023 will be 9.61%, saying today that this will be, of course, added to the other legacy decision which was made previously. Essentially, they're getting a tariff increase of what, 3.49% for the 2022-2023 financial year. What does this mean? Eskom previously said, of course, the reason they were wanting this increase was to pay for the purchase of energy from IPPs. Does this mean they'll now be purchasing less? And of course, the other reason was the increase in carbon taxes, which we heard yesterday from the finance minister that they will be going up as well. How will this impact on Eskom sustainability?
So good evening. I think, the most important thing probably to remember is that this increase of 9.65% is not yet fixed. It still needs to be approved, and there's a couple of stages it will go to before it becomes finalized, and that should happen, fairly shortly. And this is obviously Nersa's response. Eskom had their specific application, and we'll see whether this 9.6% actually stays the way it is, when the final determination comes out. In terms of the implications, clearly for Eskom it's going to be difficult, because they are suffering, as we all know, from a high level of debt, but also from a decreasing number of clients. The client base is being eroded, and it's being eroded by people building their own power plants, or alternatively by independent power utilities providing power to the private sector. So it is going to be very difficult for Eskom. From a, sort of Eskom's response point of view, I think, and I've stated this before, we need to really look at the actual numbers. They claim that it's because they need to pay IPPs, but the IPP power generation right now is a very small percentage, very small fraction of the overall capacity and overall generation capacity of Eskom and of Eskom's overall sales. So I personally don't think the impact is as big as they say it is, and they need to be very clear and public about those numbers. In terms of the carbon tax, that's something new. But again, I doubt that is a very valid reason, given when this carbon tax was announced and when the actual application was made, which was well before this carbon tax was announced. So they may either have known about the carbon tax, which is unlikely, or, throwing it into the sort of pot of excuses.
What we do know, though, is that Nersa has gone to court and they are applying to have Eskom change their methodology for defining what is an allowable revenue, and they're saying that is what they are trying to do. What does that mean for the consumers?
Look, if Nersa is successful, it will be better for the consumers in the long run. Overall, it doesn't make a very big difference. And I think I would caution that we need to be careful. It is important to get into the detail, but it's also important not to be bogged down in the detail and then to accept the overarching paradigm that Eskom almost forces you into by getting into the detail. Let's just step back for a moment and try and understand what's happening here. Inflation, we know, is well below the 9.6%. Eskom asked for a number much higher than that. Nersa came back with a response. The response is still much higher than inflation, but considered by Eskom and considered by many to be low. So this is the paradox that we face. We have an organization that is obviously in crisis, that's asking for increases that is well above inflation, and using excuses that are not completely palatable to the public. So let's not forget that just in terms of the bigger picture, in terms of the detail, it does mean that if Nersa is successful, as I said, Eskom is going to have a much more difficult time in terms of trying to get the higher increases in the long run. Nersa will be in a better position, in a much easier and much more defendable position to make its case for whatever increases it applies using the methodology then that would have been approved.
Yeah. Eskom's chief financial officer saying the board will now need to deliberate further before deciding on how to continue to sustainably provide electricity to the extent possible in the context of this revenue decision. Is this Eskom saying, well, guys, maybe in the future we might not be able to guarantee supply of electricity because of this decision?
You know, we shouldn't be scared of some of the cheap threats that are made from Eskom. Not necessarily any individual, but that are generally made from Eskom. The fact is, unfortunately, that Eskom will find it more and more difficult to provide sustainable electricity or electricity at sustainable prices as time goes on. The inherent structure of the company and the nature of its generation assets and this very centralized, basis that it operates from is going to make it very difficult for it to be sustainable. And the reason for this is that centralized energy is always going to be more expensive now that we have technologies and we have solutions for decentralized energy. And it's a trend that's already upon us. So if you look at the large mining houses, if you look at many of the large industrial actors, they are already building their own plants and taking matters into their own hands, building on-site power plants. This is what I mean by the erosion of Eskom's client base. So it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for Eskom to sustainably provide electricity at tariffs that are acceptable to the public. This means that Eskom needs to be restructured, and the government has got its plans. It started. It had the special commission and several other industry bodies providing input into what should happen at Eskom. That must be, the pace of that must be escalated. It must happen at a much faster rate. So Eskom in its current mode, and hopefully the Eskom board does not consider Eskom in its current mode going forward. And that's the concern I have. They need to consider Eskom in a much more effective mode going forward. And I don't see that happening within the organization. You can't solve a problem at the same level that it's created. And this is why what needs to happen with Eskom needs to be determined outside of Eskom. But even the current initiatives are not going fast enough. And I think it's general consensus amongst the private sector and amongst most experts that the Eskom rate of change is simply not happening fast enough.
Sinan Energy CEO there, Mohamed. Madhi, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Let's continue next.